Hey people, this is my new camera. Wiley would like to say hi. This is the Insta360 Pro version that shoots in 4K and maybe even in 8K. What do you think about it, Wiley? Not sure. So thank you all so much for watching Peter's interview about what Cobra Mist might have been. Of course, it is rather speculative. I mean, we don't really know if it's true, but I think it's got some very good evidence, and he points us in a good direction of what it might have been. So thanks, Peter, very much, and thanks for watching it. And what? Oh, okay, fair enough. But today I'm reaching out to you with a question. So Cobra Mist, if it was a genuine over-the-horizon radar, supposedly would work in the, I'm not a radio person, but in the 3 to 30 kilohertz range. That's what they tend to use to bounce off the lensing in the ionosphere to work. So I reached out to Lewis, hi, who runs a wonderful YouTube channel called Ringway Manchester. He knows everything about amateur radio and has in fact done a very good film on Cobra Mist as an over-the-horizon radar system, if it was. So I got back to him and said, thanks, Lewis, this is excellent. Did anybody in the amateur radio community, who are very good at keeping logs in the Cold War, ever hear Cobra Mist transmitting its signal out into the Soviet Union as an over-the-horizon radar? Well, he's never got back to me because possibly there are no logs from that date, or maybe he doesn't know. I don't know. This is an example of a modern over-the-horizon radar, and it was recorded by a very good radio amateur in Spain. What I think he's listening to is the French Nostradamus over-the-horizon radar, which covers from France into North Africa. Obviously, France is interested in Algeria and Morocco, Tunisia, Libya places. The French, and it also can go as far as the Ukraine if it wants to be pointing east. And here you can hear how the signal is propagated. This is the outgoing signal. The way that over-the-horizon radar works is it sends out this pulses in different frequencies. It bounces off the mirror in the sky to the ground. You get a lot of scatter. Anything that reflects that signal will bounce back. Incredibly small amount, of course, will go back up to the ionosphere and back down to the Nostradamus site in France, and it's just clutter, from palm trees or whatever they see in North Africa. But so what they do is that they strip out all the clutter, and all that an over-the-horizon radar can really see is things that move. So an airplane or a launch of a missile. That's what it's really for. And, it makes a lot of sense. But it needs this continuous pulsing of high energy from the site. And also, let's look at the site. Nostradamus is obviously a more modern over-the-horizon radar than Cobra Mist, if it was one, ever was. But it's completely different. Look, it's these kind of field of antennas. That's what Peter expected. And the same as we have in Cyprus for a genuine over-the-horizon radar. It's not fan-shaped. It's not a wedge. It doesn't have a focal point. It just propagates the signal up into the ionosphere, and then it bounces down, and then it comes back. That's what you would expect, and that's what you see in over-the-horizon radar systems everywhere else. So, question. Are you a radio amateur? Did you ever hear Cobra Mist? I mean, are there records or logs anywhere in the UK of hearing the Cobra Mist site as an over-the-horizon radar actually operating? I think not, which is interesting because, of course, if it was an EMP pulse weapon, they wouldn't have it on, would they? And it wouldn't be in those frequencies. It would be a pulse. It wouldn't be a shortwave radio transmission. As I say, I know nothing about radio, but you do. Tell me if you ever heard Cobra Mist working. If not, why? So, did Britain actually have a EMP weapons program? They did. So, an acronym that was used in the Ministry of Defence during the Cold War was NNEMP. That's non-nuclear EMP. And that was actually a project listed by the MOD as something that they had, a deployed weapon. Britain and its NATO allies took the EMP threat very seriously. I assumed because they were worried that the Ruskies or the Chinese or some enemy of NATO would possibly have an EMP nuclear device that could be exploded. I mean, EMP weapons, I think, would be the first step to a global nuclear conflict. You need to take out your enemy's, whatever side you're on's, infrastructure. An EMP device destroys radio, radar, airplanes, vehicles, and computers, and all communication. I mean, it's very, very successful blast, as Peter said, to put a country back into the Stone Age. It would destroy weapon systems and just ways of communicating. So military planners have often thought that an EMP strike would be a precursor to a full nuclear strike, or maybe that would be the whole thing. I mean, but I think there's another side to it. Now that my eyes have been opened to the possibility, and it is just a possibility. I mean, the Ministry of Defence isn't phoning me up and going, "Oh, Simon, I think you got it right." I mean, they're never going to confirm that what I'm saying or what I've heard from Peter is correct. I'm a meddling journalist. I'm interested in physics. I'm interested in the weaponization of physics. That was the whole thing that brought me here. I'm interested in what actually happened and what actually injured US service personnel at Rendlesham Forest. So, on behalf of John Burroughs, who is a loyal friend, I want to know what he was exposed to. And if there's a secret, a weapon system that could have damaged his health and others, I really think it should be out in the open. I don't ever want to expose national secrets. The whole Cobra Mist story, I mean, Cobra Mist, whatever it was, closed down in 1973. So it's a long time ago. The Cold War is over. The people who worked on it probably aren't around anymore. The Soviet Union eventually fell. I mean, I think that was part of the collapse of Cobra Mist, interestingly. But the British government of the time took EMP protection very seriously. And that was another thing that I've dug into. So there's lots of references in Hansard and in MOD type of documents about hardening buildings and hardening electronics against an EMP pulse. And as I said, I always assumed that was the enemies, but possibly, of course, if you had a doomsday EMP weapon in Orfordness pointing to Holland, Belgium, and Western Germany, and Scandinavia, very much Finland, then you, as a conventional fighting army, would not want to be affected when the weapon was fired against the invading Soviets. So lots of research was done into Faraday cages and ways of protecting and hardening electronics and buildings. And that leads me to a construction company. So there's a lot of secret stuff in Britain, a lot of hardened buildings, underground facilities, military and government buildings, and they are all built of this stuff. I had never come across it. You know, the companies say they use it for building concrete walls in hospital radiological departments, but of course it would also be used in nuclear power stations and hardening concrete buildings for military or government use. It's all out in the light of day. I mean, you can go out and buy this radiological protection concrete material, which is supplied by a British company. They are obviously doing it because they can sell it. They have a customer. I assume their customer is the British government and the MOD. For those of you who don't really understand, because I have assumed that you all know what electromagnetic pulses are, I think I'm just going to do like a primer, as they say in the US, a background. So the history of EMP really dates back to a terrible event that happened in the 19th century. It's called the Carrington Event. So our sun is a massive source of electromagnetic radiation, and it burps, bleh, quite often large pulses of this, but it's Russian roulette. As we spin around our massive sun and the sun goes bleh, with an electromagnetic pulse, most of the time, and it's happened many times, the Earth misses it. The pulse goes out into deep space and little Earth doesn't get hit. But in the 19th century, this thing called the Carrington Event, the sun burped and an electromagnetic pulse actually hit Earth's flanks. Blush. Now, it must have done a lot of damage. There's lots of reports of how it destroyed electrical equipment, but I mean, thank God it was the 19th century, because if it was the 20th or 21st century, it would have wiped out computers, cars, airplanes, hospitals, radio, radar, everything. I mean, it was electricity power grid. I mean, it's a massive event, and in the classic words of 1990s TV science, it's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when. And it's absolutely true. One day the sun, and it has done it many times since the Carrington Event, will burp and take out satellites and the national grid of our planet. You know, forget using your iPhone. There's not going to be any cellular service. Forget using your car. You know, forget buying food. It would be a major disaster, which I think would take many years to rebuild society back to where we were before an EMP event. As an aside, we live in this 16th century watermill in France, and we're very blessed, and also I like it. We have wood burning fireplaces, EMP protected. We have chickens that also lay eggs, a food source, and we are a watermill, so we live on a very fresh source of water. So we have water, food, and heat. I certainly recommend anybody, however modern a living you have, think about what you're going to eat. Think about how you're going to heat your home. And think about not having electrical or electronic devices that you need to rely on. It just makes sense. Because it will happen, either in a wartime scenario with a human EMP pulse attack, or a rogue burp from the sun will eventually hit the Earth, and it would reset society. So, there's another part of the Cobra Mist story which I actually hinted at in the first film, which I think you need to understand better and see how I believe that the Ministry of Defence were classically British and did something called economical with the truth. Here is the published declassified map of the so-called over-the-horizon radar coverage of Cobra Mist, if it was an over-the-horizon radar. And you can clearly see that it goes the other side of the Black Sea and way past Moscow, and it covers, a good area of what was the Soviet Union at the time, although it doesn't go very far past Moscow and into the areas where space and ICBM technology and rocket launches were carrying on. You'd think it would go right all the way to Kazakhstan, but even the MOD say it kind of stops just the other side of the Ukraine. But compare this map, here's side-by-side comparison, with a very interesting document that I managed to find, and this was the Soviet Union map of the coverage from Orfordness, from Cobra Mist. And it's very different. Notice that it covers mainly Holland, Belgium, Western Germany, Denmark, Finland, vitally important, Sweden and Norway. Well, we didn't want radars in those countries. They were either friendly or part of NATO. They had their own radar. Why would you need an over-the-horizon radar to look at what's going on in Copenhagen? You didn't. It's bollocks. But the areas that it did cover are exactly the areas that the Soviet Union might have entered Western Europe with a massive invasion of tanks and airplanes. It covered Finland. Think about it. Finland's on the border with the Soviet Union. It covers Eastern Germany. It covers where the tanks would have crossed the border. Well, you didn't need a radar to see that, but imagine if you had an EMP pulse weapon that could wipe out Soviet tanks, aircraft, and radar and radio. Well, that would be a fantastic weapon. So I think it makes a lot of sense that Cobra Mist was never, or modified later on, going to be an over-the-horizon radar. As Peter said, Britain, built by the Americans, had Fylingdales. Fylingdales was originally part of the DEW line, the distant early warning line that stretches from Alaska all the way to Fylingdales just outside of Scarborough in Yorkshire. And the amount of money invested in Fylingdales is massive. Fylingdales has one of the most sophisticated phased array radar. It can look definitely into space. One of its duties is to actually monitor near-Earth orbit stuff. It can see ICBMs being launched. It's also high up. It can see a long distance. And it doesn't need, this is Peter's point, it doesn't need the 1970s analog computers to find Doppler data, because that's all over-the-horizon radar can see from the clutter. There's not much comes back from an OTH radar, and what does come back needs to be interpreted for humans to actually analyze. The only things that it can see is stuff moving. You just use conventional radar of different frequencies, high power, possibly using ionospheric lensing from Fylingdales, and their real returns with pretty pictures are displayed on cathode ray tubes. You don't need analog computers to actually interpret the results. And I think that was probably one of the enormous problems of an over-the-horizon radar. And they didn't need one. And the coverage, as you saw in these maps, didn't really cover areas that were of real interest. What they did cover is land masses that were going to be potentially invaded, and you wanted to stop the invasion by blasting an EMP pulse to the invading Soviet army. It makes a lot of sense. And the other thing that you saw from the quotes I read out from Hansard and what I know about what SRI did, speaking to people who know what actually happened at Bentwaters, and what Peter obviously knows about but doesn't want to talk about really fully, is that EMP weapons, NNEMP, non-nuclear EMP, was developed. It was miniaturized to the point where it could be in a truck or in a shipping container size unit. And that, of course, gets around the massive problem that he highlighted, that, if you fire an EMP pulse to a few tanks coming across eastern Germany, goodbye Belgium. It's a serious weapon, and I think it was politically very, very dodgy that it could ever be used. I think it was probably some kind of political bargaining tool. I'm sure the Soviet Union knew what Cobra Mist really was. And I think it might have been a part of MAD, mutually assured destruction. It was a potential doomsday weapon. Don't invade East Germany, don't cross the border into Finland, because we'll effing zap you from Orfordness. Oh, and that's the other thing. I think there's a great history here. So, of course, in previous films, you've heard me say, and it's absolutely true, that Nikola Tesla's death ray, which is a particle accelerator and using electromagnetic radiation and plasma, was developed, tried to be built from stolen plans on Orfordness. Is that a bit of a coincidence that Britain uses Orfordness as a test laboratory for directed energy weapons? I mean, Tesla's death ray was definitely a directed energy weapon. I don't think it worked. I don't think Britain got it working. I think it was possibly refined later on, maybe by the Soviets and certainly by the Americans. But did the Brits move on from Tesla's death ray to a non-nuclear EMP device called Cobra Mist and built it on Orfordness? I think that's too much of a coincidence to ignore. So, did you dig a hole with a JCB backhoe in Orfordness and pump out the water for an underground facility? Now, you might have done that and you just thought it was a bit of a contract for a couple of days to build a concrete structure under the nest. Did you lay very large central electricity generating cables under Orfordness to the Cobra Mist facility? Why were they under the shingle? Why weren't they just pylons? Well, they were under the shingle to protect them and to keep them secret. Were you involved in laying the cables? Did you actually work at Cobra Mist? I mean, that's the people I want to talk to. You were probably told it was an experimental radio facility. That's what I think you were told to say that you were working on. And did you believe that what you were doing there was a radar system? Or can you tell us that you had your doubts about that? Oh, and then just a final thought, another piece of this puzzle jigsaw, and is the control center for Cobra Mist. Everybody knows was built on Orfordness and it's subject to flooding, so it was built on stilts. Oh good, I get to use the word bollocks again. Yeah, it wasn't built on stilts to protect it only from flooding, although that's possibly a side effect. It was built on stilts to put it into off-the-ground Faraday cage EMP protection. Those stilts were insulators from the ground plane of the Earth in Suffolk. Those stilts, hundreds of them, held up a fantastically overprotected Faraday cage building. The outside of it is a giant mesh structure, and inside, individual rooms have double Faraday cages. They really wanted to protect the Cobra Mist building from EMP. Why? And over-the-horizon radar is just a field of antennas, all in shortwave. An over-the-horizon radar isn't a fan structure. An over-the-horizon radar isn't built like a wedge. An over-the-horizon radar doesn't face Rendlesham Forest. It would face the Soviet Union. An over-the-horizon radar would go thousands of miles deep into the Soviet Union. Cobra Mist was built backwards. It was a wedge shape, and its area of coverage was Western Europe, Belgium, Holland, West Germany, Denmark, Finland, Sweden, and Norway. It doesn't make any sense as a radar. And the SRI story of what they actually did at Bentwaters and Martlesham Heath pretty well nails it. I, of course, can't say any of this is factual. It's putting 2 and 2 together. Maybe I'm making slightly more than 4. I don't know. But what I do know is the weaponization of physics was the key word to the Cold War. Physics went dark. Physics, since the Manhattan Project, has been secret. We, as humans, have built weapon systems using advanced physics. And I want to understand that. I want to explain those systems to you. So are you interested in this subject? I hope you are, because this is definitely the new direction that my channel is going in, to actually understand the history of physics and the way it was weaponized. If you do like this, please tell YouTube that you like it by giving it a thumbs up, sharing, and leaving a comment. And of course, if you dug a hole in Orfordness with a JCB, get in touch. Because of you, the truth will be out there. Thank you.